The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would split my life into before and after, the way lightning splits an oak tree down to its roots. I was dreaming of summer rain when my phone screamed at me awake, that piercing emergency tone that sends ice straight through your chest before your brain even processes what's happening. The number was local but unfamiliar, and for a moment I considered letting it ring through to voicemail. Later, I would wish I had. Is this Sarah Chen? The voice is professional, careful, the kind that's been trained to deliver devastation with clinical precision. Yes. My throat felt raw, though I hadn't spoken in hours. Who is this? This is Captain Rodriguez with the Metro Fire Department. Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a fire at your residence on Maple Street. The structure is a total loss. The words bounced off me at first, meaningless as stones skipping across water. Total loss. My little blue house with the crooked shutters and the garden I'd spent 3 years coaxing back to life. The house that was mine, completely and utterly mine. I'm sorry, what? I sat up, the sheets tangling around my legs like accusations. There's been a mistake. I'm not there. I'm at my boyfriend's place across town. Ma'am, we have your address confirmed. 847 Maple Street, single-story ranch, blue exterior with white trim. The fire started around 2 a.m. By the time neighbors called it in, the structure was fully engulfed. Fully engulfed. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I was standing, pacing the length of Jake's bedroom in my bare feet, my heart hammering against my ribs. My cat, I whispered, then louder. My cat is in there. Whiskers, he's gray and white. He hides under the bed when he's scared. Did you find him? Did you get him out? The silence stretched too long, filled with the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic that never sleeps in this city. When Captain Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice had lost some of his professional edge, becoming gentler, more human. Ma'am, I'm very sorry. We did recover a cat from the residence. The smoke inhalation, it would have been very quick. The phone slipped from my fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a plastic crack that seemed to echo through the entire universe. Jake was beside me then, his warm hands on my shoulders, his voice asking questions I couldn't process. All I could see was Whiskers' face, the way he'd purr so loudly when I came home from work, vibrating like a tiny gray engine of pure contentment. The way he'd follow me from room to room, always needing to be where I was, as if my presence was the most important thing in his small, perfect world. I'd rescued Whiskers from a kill shelter 3 years ago, nursing him back to health from near death. And now he was gone. Burned alive in the house I bought to keep us both safe. Jake drove me there, his Toyota cutting through the empty pre-dawn streets while I sat in the passenger seat, feeling like my soul had been scraped hollow with a rusty spoon. The smell hit us 3 blocks away. That acrid, chemical stench of burned plastic and dreams turned to ash. By the time we turned on Maple Street, my eyes were already streaming, though I told myself it was just the smoke. My house, my beautiful little house, was gone. In its place squatted a blackened skeleton, charred beams reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. The roof had collapsed entirely, and where my kitchen window used to frame the morning light, there was only a gaping mouth filled with darkness and destruction. Yellow tape fluttered in the pre-dawn breeze, and fire trucks lined the street like sleeping giants, the red and silver hulks reflecting the strobing emergency lights that painted everything in alternating shadows and artificial daylight. I stumbled out of the car before Jake had even put it in park, my bare feet hitting the cold asphalt as I ran toward what used to be my front door. A firefighter caught me before I could cross the tape line, his gloved hands gentle but firm as he guided me back to safety.
Easy there, miss. It's not safe. The structure could collapse further at any time. My cat, I said, the words coming out as a broken whisper. Where is my cat? He looked toward another firefighter, an older man with kind eyes and soot-streaked cheeks, who was approaching us with something wrapped in a blanket. My knees gave out then, right there on the street, as I understood what he was carrying. Jake caught me, held me up as the kind-eyed firefighter knelt beside me and placed the small bundle in my arms. Whiskers looked like he was sleeping, his gray fur still soft despite everything. Someone had cleaned the soot from his face, and his expression was peaceful, almost content. I pressed my face against his still form and sobbed until there was nothing left inside me but raw, howling emptiness. That's when I saw her. My mother was standing across the street, partially hidden behind a parked van, but I would recognize that silhouette anywhere. The sharp shoulders, the perfectly styled hair that never moved in the wind, the way she held herself like she was posing for an invisible photographer. Even at 4 a.m, even at the scene of her daughter's devastation, Linda Hartwell looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful women who had their lives perfectly together. Our eyes met across the chaos of emergency vehicles and curious neighbors, and something cold and terrible passed between us. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look horrified or concerned or any of the things a normal mother might look like when seeing her child's life reduced to ash and rubble. She looked satisfied, like someone who had just watched a long-anticipated movie reach its climactic scene. Then she turned and walked away, her high heels clicking against the sidewalk with mechanical precision, disappearing into the shadows between streetlights like she'd never been there at all. But she had been there, and somewhere deep in my grief-shattered chest, a tiny flame of something darker than sorrow began to burn. The fire inspector arrived as the sun was coming up, painting the destruction in shades of gold and orange that felt like a mockery. He was a small, methodical man with wire-rimmed glasses who took photographs and measurements while I sat on the curb, still holding Whiskers, watching strangers catalog the remains of my life. "Any idea how it might have started?" he asked, approaching me with a clipboard and the careful demeanor of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "Any electrical problems? Space heaters? Candles left burning?" I shook my head, too numb to trust my voice. I was religious about fire safety, obsessive even. I'd grown up hearing Linda's stories about house fires, cautionary tales delivered with the kind of relish that should have been my first warning sign. Every night before bed, I checked the stove, unplugged unnecessary electronics, and made sure there were no candles burning. It was a ritual as automatic as brushing my teeth. "We'll know more after we investigate," the inspector continued, making notes on his clipboard. "But I have to ask, is there anyone who might want to harm you? Anyone with access to the property who might have a reason to—" "My mother has a key," I said, the words falling out of me before I could stop them. The inspector looked up from his clipboard, his expression sharpening slightly. We had an argument recently. She said some things." What I didn't tell him was exactly what those things were. How Linda had sat in my living room just 2 weeks ago, her manicured fingers drumming against my coffee table as she delivered her ultimatum with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. How she'd looked around my little house with obvious disgust, taking in the secondhand furniture and the plants I'd nursed back to health, and the photos of friends who actually cared about me. "This whole independence charade has gone on long enough, Sarah," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment that had followed me through childhood like a persistent shadow. "You're 32 years old, living in this hovel, working at that dead-end job, wasting your potential. It's embarrassing. I have a position waiting for you at Hartwell Industries, a real career with real prospects. All you have to do is stop this stubborn nonsense and come home where you belong." When I'd refused, again, her expression had shifted into something I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more calculated. "You think you can just reject everything I've built for you? Everything I've sacrificed to give you opportunities?" She'd stood then, smoothing down her perfect skirt with practiced precision. "Fine, but don't expect me to watch you throw your life away indefinitely. Sometimes children need to learn consequences the hard way." At the time, I thought she meant she would cut me off financially, maybe stop the occasional deposits she made into my account despite my repeated requests for her to stop. I never imagined she meant this. I never imagined she was capable of this. But as I sat there in the growing daylight, holding my dead cat while strangers poked through the ashes of everything I'd worked for, I kept seeing that satisfied look on her face, the way she'd been standing there, watching, like she was admiring her handiwork. The fire inspector took my statement, his questions probing but professional. I told him about the argument, about Linda's threats, about seeing her at the scene. He wrote it all down with the same methodical attention he'd given to photographing the burn patterns on my collapsed walls. "We'll look into it," he said finally, handing me his card. "In the meantime, do you have somewhere to stay? Insurance will cover temporary housing once we filed a report." I nodded toward Jake, who had been standing quietly beside me through the whole ordeal, his presence as steady and reassuring as a lighthouse in a storm. He'd already offered to let me stay with him as long as I needed, no questions asked, no conditions attached. The kindness in his offer had nearly broken me all over again, because it highlighted the vast difference between chosen family and blood family, between people who loved you and people who merely owned you. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look at the ruins of my house, trying to memorize the shape of my loss. The firefighters were packing up their equipment, the neighbors were drifting back to their own lives, and the sun was climbing higher, promising another ordinary day for everyone except me. But I wasn't thinking about ordinary days anymore. I was thinking about my mother's face in the darkness, about the click of her heels against the sidewalk as she walked away from the destruction she'd orchestrated. I was thinking about Whiskers, about the trust in his green eyes, and the way he'd purred himself to sleep every night, believing he was safe because I was there to protect him. And I was thinking about fire, about how it could destroy everything in a matter of hours, leaving nothing behind but ash and regret, and the kind of rage that burns slow and steady, like embers buried deep beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite into an inferno. The first week after the fire passed like a fever dream, each day bleeding into the next in a haze of insurance forms, police interviews, and the strange liminal space of existing without a home. Jake's apartment became my refuge, but even kindness felt foreign against my skin now, like clothes that belonged to someone else. I moved through his space like a ghost, haunting her own afterlife, careful not to disturb anything, afraid that my newly acquired talent for destruction might spread to the things he loved too. I'd buried Whiskers in the pet cemetery on the east side of town, a small plot beneath an oak tree where the morning light filtered through the leaves in golden patches that reminded me of his fur. The funeral director was a gentle woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd seen too many grieving pet owners to offer empty platitudes. Instead, she'd simply handed me a small wooden box and said, "Take all the time you need." I'd sat there for 3 hours, talking to him the way I used to when he'd curl up on my chest during thunderstorms, telling him I was sorry, that I'd failed to keep him safe, that I'd trade places with him if I could. Jake found me there as the sun was setting, my voice hoarse from crying and confessing and begging forgiveness from someone who would never purr in response again. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me on the bench and waited while I said goodbye to the only living thing that had ever loved me unconditionally.
The insurance adjuster came by on Thursday, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Martinez, who looked at the ruins of my house with the dispassionate efficiency of someone who'd seen countless disasters reduced to line items on claim forms. She asked the same questions the fire inspector had asked, took the same photos, made the same careful notations about potential causes and contributing factors. "The preliminary report suggests an accelerant was used," she said, consulting her tablet with professional detachment. "Probably gasoline based on the burn patterns. This wasn't accidental, Miss Chen. Someone wanted your house to burn, and they wanted it to burn fast." The words should have shocked me, but they settled into my chest like stones I'd been expecting to swallow. Of course it was arson. Of course someone had poured gasoline around my foundation and lit a match, watching from the safety of the street as my life went up in flames. The only question was whether I'd ever be able to prove who had struck that match. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Rebecca asked, her stylus poised over her tablet. "Anyone who had access to the property? Anyone with a motive?" I thought about Linda's key, still gleaming on her perfect key ring.
about the way she'd looked at my house like it was a personal insult to her vision of how her daughter should live, about the ultimatum she'd delivered with such casual cruelty, and the threat that had followed my refusal. "My mother," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "We had a disagreement recently. She has a key." Rebecca's stylist stopped moving. She looked up at me with the kind of sharp attention that suggested this wasn't the first family arson case she'd encountered. What kind of disagreement? So I told her about Linda's demand that I abandon my independent life and come work for the family business, about her fury when I'd refused to be the grateful, obedient daughter she'd scripted in her head, about the veiled threats and the way she'd looked at my house like it was an obstacle to be removed rather than a home to be respected. She said I needed to learn consequences, I finished, my voice barely above a whisper. She said she wouldn't watch me throw my life away indefinitely. Rebecca made more notes, her expression thoughtful. "We'll need to coordinate with the police investigation, but this gives us a direction to pursue. In the meantime, your policy covers temporary housing and replacement of personal property. We'll get you set up with a rental and start the claims process for your belongings. But how do you file a claim for a life? How do you put a dollar amount on the feeling of safety, on the knowledge that you have a place in the world that belongs to you and you alone? How do you replace 3 years of careful choices, of slowly building something that reflected who you really were instead of who everyone else wanted you to be?" The rental Rebecca arranged was a sterile one-bedroom apartment and a complex that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams. Everything was beige and neutral and aggressively inoffensive, as if the designers had set out to create a space that would leave no impression on anyone who lived there. I moved in with 2 suitcases of clothes Jake had helped me buy, and a heart that felt like it had been scraped raw with steel wool. The first night there, I lay on the unfamiliar mattress, staring at the popcorn ceiling, and listening to my upstairs neighbors arguing about money. The silence was wrong. No purring, no small paws padding across hardwood floors, no sense of belonging anywhere. I'd gotten so used to Whiskers' presence that his absence felt like a physical wound, a constant ache just below my ribs that made it hard to breathe. I called in sick to work for the rest of that week, unable to face the well-meaning condolences and awkward questions from coworkers who'd heard about the fire on the local news. My boss, Mr. Peterson, was understanding in that careful way of people who wanted to help but didn't know how. He told me to take all the time I needed, that my job would be waiting when I was ready to come back. But I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for anything again. The fire had burned away more than my house and my cat. It had incinerated the version of myself I'd spent years becoming, the Sarah who'd believed in fresh starts and second chances, and the possibility of building something that reflected who you really were instead of who everyone else wanted you to be.
Beautiful from nothing. The Sarah who'd trusted that love and hard work could create safety in an uncertain world. That Sarah had been naive, optimistic in a way that now seemed almost offensive. This new Sarah, the one who'd emerged from the ashes, understood things the old one had been too sheltered to grasp. She understood that family could be the most dangerous enemy of all, because they knew exactly how to hurt you in ways that would leave scars no one else could see. She understood that safety was an illusion, that everything you loved could be destroyed by someone else's cruelty, and that the people who were supposed to protect you might be the ones holding the matches. Detective Ray Morrison called on a gray Tuesday morning that felt like the world had forgotten how to make colors. He was the lead investigator on my case, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd spent years convincing traumatized people to trust him with their worst experiences. "We'd like to interview your mother," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Based on your statement and the physical evidence, we have enough to bring her in for questioning. I wanted to give you a heads up before we made contact." My heart started hammering against my ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. Part of me had been hoping I was wrong, that my suspicions were just grief playing tricks on my mind. But the larger part, the part that had been living with Linda's particular brand of conditional love for 32 years, knew I was right. Of course she'd done it. Of course she'd chosen to destroy rather than accept defeat. What happens if she admits to it? I asked. If we can prove arson, she'll be charged with first-degree arson, animal cruelty, and possibly attempted murder if the prosecutor decides you were intended to be in the house when it burned. We're talking about serious prison time. Attempted murder. The words hit me like a physical blow. Had she known I was at Jake's that night? Had she counted on my being asleep in my own bed, trusting that the daughter who disappointed her so thoroughly would burn along with the house that represented her defiance? Miss Chen, Detective Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? I don't know, I said honestly. I don't think I've been all right since this started. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the soft scratch of pen against paper. I know this is difficult. Family cases always are. But I want you to know we're taking this seriously. What happened to you and your cat, it wasn't random and it wasn't justified, no matter what disagreement you might have had with your mother. After he hung up, I sat in my beige rental apartment feeling like I was made of glass, fragile enough to shatter at the slightest touch. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold on a television screen. My mother was going to be arrested for trying to kill me. My mother had murdered my cat and burned down my house because I'd refused to live my life according to her specifications. The woman who'd taught me to ride a bike and bought me my first car and insisted I call her every Sunday no matter what. The woman who'd also criticized every choice I'd ever made, who'd made her love contingent on my compliance, who'd treated my independence like a personal betrayal that required punishment. I tried to remember the good times, the moments when Linda had seemed like a real mother, instead of a director managing an uncooperative actress. Family vacations where she'd actually laughed at my jokes. Christmas mornings when she seemed genuinely delighted by my excitement over presents. The night she'd stayed up with me when I had the flu in high school, bringing me soup and checking my temperature every few hours. But even those memories felt contaminated now, tainted with the knowledge of what she was capable of when I didn't play the roles she'd written for me. Had any of it been real? Or had it all been performance, love dispensed as a reward for good behavior and withdrawn the moment I stepped out of line?
Jake found me that evening sitting on the floor of my empty apartment, surrounded by insurance forms and police reports, and a growing pile of paperwork that seemed to be the only tangible evidence that my life had ever existed. He sat down beside me without a word. His presence is steady and comforting as always. The detective called, I said, not looking up from the form I was pretending to read. They're going to arrest her. Good, he said simply. Is it? I looked at him then. This man who'd taken me in without question, who'd held me while I sobbed over a dead cat and never once suggested I should get over it faster. She's my mother, Jake. She's the only family I have left. No, he said, his voice gentle but firm. She stopped being your family the moment she decided to hurt you. Family doesn't try to kill you because you won't do what they want. But what if I'm wrong? What if she didn't do it? What if I'm destroying an innocent person because I'm angry and hurt and looking for someone to blame? Jake was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. Sarah, I've watched you blame yourself for everything bad that's ever happened to you. Your dad leaving when you were 10, your mother's criticism, bad relationships, failed job interviews. You've spent your whole life assuming that if something went wrong, it must be because you weren't good enough or smart enough or worthy enough to deserve better. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm and real and anchoring me to the present moment. But this isn't your fault. Someone burned down your house and killed your cat, and the evidence points to your mother. You didn't make her do that. You didn't deserve it. And recognizing that she's capable of cruelty isn't the same thing as destroying an innocent person. I wanted to believe him.
I wanted to let go of the guilt that had wrapped itself around my chest like barbed wire, cutting deeper every time I tried to breathe. But 32 years of Linda's conditioning was hard to shake. The call came 3 days later. Detective Morrison's voice was carefully professional, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. "We've made an arrest. Your mother was taken into custody this morning on charges of first-degree arson and animal cruelty. She's being held without bail." "Did she confess?" The words came out as a whisper. "Not exactly. But we found evidence in her garage, gasoline containers that matched the accelerant used in the fire, and security footage from a gas station showing her filling them the night before your house burned down. Her alibi fell apart under questioning." I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt relief that the person who destroyed my life was finally facing consequences. Instead, I felt hollow, emptied out, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything that made me human. "What happens now?" I asked. "The district attorney will review the case and decide on additional charges. Given the evidence and the fact that you could have been killed that night if you'd been home, they'll probably add attempted murder to the charges. We're looking at a potential sentence of 25 years to life." 25 years to life. Linda would be an old woman when she got out, if she ever got out at all. The mother who'd once braided my hair and taught me to drive and insisted on taking pictures of every milestone would spend the rest of her life in prison because she couldn't accept that I'd grown up to be someone other than who she wanted me to be. After I hung up, I sat in my rental apartment and cried for the mother I'd lost long before the fire, for the relationship that had been built on conditions and control instead of love and acceptance. I cried for Whiskers, who died because he'd trusted me to keep him safe. I cried for the naive woman I'd been just 2 weeks ago, who still believed that family meant something, that blood created bonds that couldn't be broken by cruelty or selfishness or the kind of rage that burned hot enough to turn homes into ash.
And then, when there were no more tears left, I started planning how to build a life from the ruins of everything I'd lost. The arraignment was held in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and broken promises, its marble floors worn smooth by decades of defendants and victims seeking justice that never quite looked the way they'd imagined it would. I sat in the back row, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white, watching as my mother was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit that made her look smaller somehow, diminished in a way I'd never seen before. But the woman standing before Judge Martinez looked fragile, her perfectly styled hair now flat and lifeless, her manicured nails chipped and ragged. For a moment, I felt a stab of something that might have been pity, a ghost of the daughter I'd been before I learned what she was truly capable of. The prosecutor, a stern-faced woman named District Attorney Patricia Vance, read the charges in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. The defendant is charged with first-degree arson, animal cruelty resulting in death, and attempted murder in the first degree. The state alleges that on the night of March 15th, the defendant deliberately set fire to her daughter's residence with the intent to cause death or serious bodily harm. Attempted murder? Even though Detective Morrison had warned me this was coming, hearing it spoken aloud in that formal courtroom setting made it real in a way that physical evidence couldn't. My own mother had tried to kill me. Not in a moment of rage or temporary insanity, but with premeditation, planning, the methodical gathering of gasoline and matches, and the patience to wait for the right moment to destroy everything I'd built. Linda's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Marcus Rothschild, who looked like he'd charged by the minute, entered a plea of not guilty on her behalf. His voice was smooth and confident, the kind of practiced eloquence that money could buy. As he spoke, Linda turned slightly in her seat, her eyes scanning the courtroom until they found mine. The look she gave me was unlike anything I'd ever seen from her before. Not the disappointment I'd grown accustomed to or the frustrated love that had characterized most of our relationship.
This was pure, concentrated hatred, the kind of fury that burns cold and patient and utterly without mercy. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood anyway. This is your fault. Even now, even sitting in a courtroom wearing a prison orange and facing the possibility of life behind bars, she couldn't accept responsibility for what she'd done. It was my fault for refusing to be the daughter she'd wanted. My fault for choosing independence over obedience. My fault for forcing her hand, for making her resort to fire and violence to teach me the lesson she'd been trying to impart for years. I left the courthouse feeling like I'd been turned inside out, raw and exposed to the elements I had no protection against. Jake was waiting for me in the hallway, his presence as solid and reassuring as always, but even his steady comfort couldn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones when I saw the hatred in my mother's eyes. "How are you holding up?" he asked, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the exit. "I don't know," I said honestly. She looked at me like she wanted to finish what she started. Jake stopped walking, his hand on my arm as he turned to face me fully. "Sarah, she can't hurt you anymore. She's in jail. She's going to stay in jail for a very long time." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his own eyes. We both knew that Linda Hartwell didn't build a business empire by accepting defeat gracefully. She was a woman who found ways around obstacles, who turned setbacks into comebacks through sheer force of will and careful manipulation. Prison jumpsuit or not, she was still dangerous, still plotting, still convinced that I was the problem that needed to be solved. The media attention started the next day. The story had everything local news loved: wealth, family drama, arson, and the kind of twisted psychology that made people lock their doors and check on their own family members with new suspicion. Prominent businesswoman accused of burning down daughter's house ran as the lead story on 3 different channels, complete with file footage of Linda accepting awards and giving speeches about corporate responsibility. My phone started ringing constantly, reporters wanting statements, neighbors curious about details, distant relatives emerging from years of silence to offer sympathy that felt more like voyeurism. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize and learned to avoid the grocery stores and coffee shops where I might be recognized by someone who'd seen my face on the evening news.
The worst part was the comments section on the news websites, where strangers dissected my relationship with my mother like amateur psychologists with too much time and too little compassion. Half of them painted me as an ungrateful daughter who'd driven a loving mother to desperate measures. The other half treated Linda like a monster while speculating about what kind of childhood trauma must have created someone capable of such cruelty. Neither narrative felt true to the complicated reality of our relationship, but I'd learned long ago that the truth rarely mattered as much as the story people wanted to believe. 3 weeks after the arraignment, Marcus Rothschild called me. His voice on the phone was professionally courteous, but carried an undercurrent of something that made my skin crawl. The tone of a man who was used to getting what he wanted through carefully applied pressure. "Miss Chen, I represent your mother in the current legal proceedings. I was hoping we might be able to discuss the possibility of a resolution that would be beneficial for everyone involved." "What kind of resolution?" I asked, though I already suspected where this conversation was heading. "Your mother is prepared to make a generous offer for pain and suffering, replacement of property, and compensation for emotional distress. In exchange, she would hope that you might reconsider your cooperation with the prosecution. Without your testimony, the state's case becomes significantly more difficult to prove." There it was. Blood money. A payment for my silence. My complicity in letting her escape the consequences of trying to murder me. I wondered if this was how she'd solved problems throughout her business career. Write a check large enough to make inconvenient truths disappear, buy silence from anyone who might testify to her methods. How much? I asked, not because I was interested, but because I wanted to know what she thought my life was worth. $2 million, he said without hesitation. Tax-free, paid into an account of your choosing with a confidentiality agreement that would prevent you from discussing the details of your relationship with Mrs. Hartwell or the circumstances of the fire. $2 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to buy a new house, start a new life, disappear entirely if I wanted. All I had to do was pretend my mother hadn't tried to kill me. All I had to do was let her buy her freedom with blood money and go back to being the kind of daughter who knew when to stay quiet. No, I said, the word coming out stronger and clearer than I'd expected. There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Rothschild hadn't considered the possibility that I might refuse. Miss Chen, I think you should take some time to consider this offer. $2 million is a life-changing amount of money. It could give you the fresh start you've been looking for. My cat is still dead. My house is still ashes, and my mother still tried to murder me because I wouldn't do what she wanted. No amount of money changes any of that. Your mother is a pillar of this community. She's created hundreds of jobs, donated millions to charity, supported causes that have made real differences in people's lives. Sending her to prison serves no one. It destroys a productive member of society and accomplishes nothing but revenge. Justice. It accomplishes justice. After I hung up, I sat at my rental apartment feeling strangely lighter, as if refusing Linda's money had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. For years, she had trained me to believe that everything could be bought, that problems could be solved with the right combination of money and influence. But some things couldn't be purchased. Whiskers' life couldn't be bought back. My sense of safety couldn't be restored with a check. And my mother's freedom wasn't for sale, no matter how many zeros she was willing to add to the offer.
The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. District Attorney Vance met with me twice to prepare my testimony, walking me through the questions she would ask and the cross-examination I should expect from Rothschild. She was a formidable woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, but her voice was gentle when she talked about what I'd been through. Testifying against a parent is never easy, she said during our second meeting. The defense is going to try to make this about family dysfunction, about a daughter who's vindictive and ungrateful. They'll suggest that you're lying or exaggerating or mistaken about your mother's involvement. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Linda's face in the courtroom, about the hatred in her eyes and the silent accusation she'd mouthed across the rows of wooden benches. She tried to kill me, I said simply. Whatever else our relationship was, whatever mistakes I've made as a daughter, that fact doesn't change. But preparing to testify was one thing. Actually doing it would be another challenge entirely, and I could feel the approaching trial date like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of destruction. It was during this waiting period, this strange liminal time between accusation and judgment, that everything changed again. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday in early May, exactly 7 weeks after my house had burned down. I'd been having trouble sleeping since the fire, my dreams filled with smoke and flames and Whiskers' terrified cries. So I was awake when my phone rang, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of my upstairs neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls. The number was local but unfamiliar, and for a moment I considered letting it ring through to voicemail. But something about the timing felt urgent, important, in a way I couldn't explain. I answered on the fourth ring. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was male, professional, with the careful tone I'd learned to associate with official bad news. "Yes. Who is this?" This is Captain Williams with Metro Fire Department. Ma'am, there's been a fire at 1247 Hillcrest Manor. The property is registered to Linda Hartwell. I understand she's your mother. For a moment, I couldn't process what he was saying. The words seemed to float in the air between us, refusing to arrange themselves into meaning. I'm sorry, what? Your mother's residence has been destroyed in a fire. The structure is a total loss. We weren't sure who to contact, but your name was listed as an emergency contact in her personal effects. Linda's house was gone. The mansion on Hillcrest Manor, with its perfect landscaping and marble foyer, and the wing she'd added specifically to showcase her art collection. The house where I'd grown up, where she hosted charity galas and business dinners and maintained the image of successful respectability that meant everything to her. When did it happen? I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. The call came in around midnight. By the time our crews arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. The fire burned extremely hot and fast. We suspect an accelerant was used. An accelerant. Just like my house, just like the gasoline Linda had used to turn my life into ashes and smoke. Was anyone hurt? I asked, though I already knew Linda was in jail, safely removed from the destruction of her own carefully curated world. No casualties. The property was unoccupied at the time of the fire. But ma'am, I have to ask, do you know of anyone who might have had reason to target this property? Any threats your mother might have received? Any disputes that could have escalated to this level? I thought about the trial preparation, about the media coverage, about the way some of the online comments had gotten increasingly ugly and personal. Linda had made enemies throughout her career. Business rivals, former employees, people who had been on the wrong side of her ruthless climb to success. But the timing was too coincidental, too perfectly symmetrical to be random.
Someone had burned down my mother's house exactly 7 weeks after she'd burned down mine. Someone had used the same method, the same accelerant, the same deliberate destruction. Someone had decided that Linda Hartwell needed to learn what it felt like to lose everything in a single night. I don't know, I lied, because I wasn't ready to voice the suspicion that was already taking shape in my mind. She has a lot of business dealings. There could be any number of people with grievances. After Captain Williams hung up, I sat in the dark of my rental apartment, trying to process what I'd just learned. Linda's mansion was gone, reduced to the same ash and rubble that had been my fate 7 weeks earlier. The house where she'd raised me, where she'd built her image as a successful businesswoman and pillar of the community, where she'd stored all the beautiful things that proved her worth to a world that measured value in marble countertops and crystal chandeliers. I should have felt satisfaction. I should have felt like the universe had finally balanced the scales, like cosmic justice had delivered the same punishment to my mother that she'd inflicted on me. Instead, I felt hollow, emptied out, like someone had carved away everything inside me that was capable of emotion. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Now she knows how it feels. You're welcome. The words sent ice water through my veins. Someone had burned down Linda's house for me, as a gift, as revenge served on my behalf. Someone had committed arson and possibly risked lives to make my mother understand what she'd put me through. Someone thought they were helping, that this act of destruction was justice, that I would be grateful for their vigilante intervention. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone aside with trembling hands. This wasn't justice. This was escalation. This was a spiral of violence and revenge that would consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but ash and regret and the kind of destruction that multiplied like cancer until it devoured everyone it touched. The next morning brought a parade of phone calls. Reporters who'd caught wind of the story, Detective Morrison asking if I had any information about potential suspects, and Marcus Rothschild, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Ms. Chen, I hope you understand the seriousness of what's happened," he said without preamble. "My client's property has been destroyed in what appears to be a retaliatory attack. If you have any information about who might be responsible, you have a legal and moral obligation to share it." "I don't know anything about it," I said, which was technically true. I didn't know who had sent that text message, who had poured gasoline around Linda's mansion and lit it on fire. I only knew that someone thought they were doing me a favor, and that knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone. "This appears to be connected to the media coverage of your mother's case," Rothschild continued. "Someone has taken your accusations and used them as justification for vigilante justice. You bear some responsibility for creating the climate that led to this attack. My mother burned down my house and killed my cat. I didn't create anything. I just told the truth." But even as I said it, I could feel doubt creeping in around the edges. Had my cooperation with the prosecution somehow led to this? Had my refusal to take Linda's blood money inspired someone to take justice into their own hands? Was I responsible, even indirectly, for the destruction of her home? The questions followed me through the rest of the day, through the grocery shopping and laundry and other mundane tasks that somehow seemed surreal in the context of everything that had happened. I moved through my routine like an actress playing a role she didn't understand, going through the motions of normal life while my world continued to spin further and further out of control.
That evening, Jake came over with takeout from the Thai place we both loved, though neither of us had much appetite. We sat on my rental apartment's generic couch, pushing pad thai around our containers while the local news played footage of Linda's burned mansion, the camera lingering on the blackened skeleton of what had once been her showplace kitchen. "Someone's trying to help you," Jake said quietly, his eyes on the television screen. "They saw what she did to you, and they decided to return the favor." "I didn't ask for help," I said. "I didn't want this." "I know you didn't, but can you honestly say you're not glad it happened?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Was I glad? Part of me was, the part that had been hurt and angry and desperate for some acknowledgement that what Linda had done to me was wrong, unforgivable, worthy of consequences. Part of me felt satisfied knowing that she would sit in her jail cell and imagine her perfect house burning, her beautiful things turning to ash, her carefully constructed life crumbling the same way mine had. But the larger part of me, the part that had been raised to be better than my worst impulses, felt sick at the thought that someone had committed a serious crime in my name. Someone had risked their own freedom, possibly their own life, to make a point about justice that I wasn't sure I wanted made. "It doesn't matter if I'm glad," I said finally. "Someone committed arson because of me. Someone thought they were doing me a favor by burning down a house. What if there had been people inside? What if the fire had spread to neighboring properties? What if someone had died trying to give me revenge I never asked for?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, twirling noodles around his fork without eating them. "Your mother tried to kill you," he said eventually. "She murdered your cat and burned down your house because you wouldn't do what she wanted. If someone decided that deserved payback, that's not on you. That's on her, for creating a situation where people felt like vigilante justice was necessary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow responsible, that my decision to cooperate with the prosecution had set off a chain reaction I couldn't control or stop. The text message on my phone felt like evidence of a debt I hadn't known I was incurring, a favor I hadn't asked for but was apparently expected to be grateful for. 3 days later, Detective Morrison called with an update that made everything even more complicated. "We've reviewed the security footage from the neighborhood around your mother's house," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The camera caught a figure near the property around the time the fire started, but the image quality isn't good enough for a positive identification. Whoever it was, they knew how to avoid the main surveillance points. Any leads on who it might be?"
We're investigating several possibilities. People who've been following the case online, former employees of your mother's company who might have grudges, even family friends who felt she got what she deserved. The truth is, your mother made a lot of enemies over the years. This could be connected to your case, or it could be someone settling an entirely different score. After he hung up, I realized that I didn't want them to catch whoever had burned down Linda's house. The thought surprised me with its clarity. I should want justice, should want the person responsible to face consequences for their crime, but instead I felt protective of this unknown arsonist. This person who'd looked at my situation and decided that Linda Hartwell needed to understand what it felt like to lose everything in a single night. That evening, another text message appeared on my phone, from the same unknown number. She had it coming. You don't owe her forgiveness. You don't owe her anything. This time, instead of feeling afraid or responsible, I felt something else entirely. I felt understood. Whoever this person was, they saw the situation clearly. They recognized that Linda's destruction of my life hadn't been a momentary lapse of judgment or a family dispute that got out of hand. It had been a calculated act of cruelty, the kind of deliberate violence that deserved to be answered in kind.
I didn't respond to the message, but I didn't delete it either. Instead, I saved it, along with the first one, evidence of someone who understood what Linda had taken from me and thought it mattered enough to risk everything to balance the scales. The trial was still 3 weeks away, but already I could feel everything changing. The simple narrative of victim and perpetrator had become something more complex, more morally ambiguous. Linda was still the woman who tried to kill me, but now she was also a victim herself. Someone whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. And I was still the daughter whose house had burned down with her cat inside, but now I was also potentially connected to another arson, another act of deliberate destruction. The line between justice and revenge had blurred beyond recognition, and I was no longer sure which side of it I was standing on. The revelation came not with dramatic fanfare or courtroom theatrics, but in the quiet desperation of a phone call at 3 a.m, 2 weeks before Linda's trial was set to begin. I'd been lying awake again, my mind churning through the testimony I'd have to give, when my phone lit up with a call from the county jail. You have a collect call from an inmate at Metro Correctional Facility. Will you accept the charges? I should have hung up. I should have rolled over and gone back to staring at the ceiling, pretending I hadn't heard my mother's voice asking the automated system to connect her to my number. But something in the mechanical politeness of the recording made me hesitate, and before I could stop myself, I was pressing the button to accept. Sarah. Linda's voice was different than I remembered, smaller somehow, stripped of the commanding presence that had defined her for as long as I'd known her. Thank you for taking my call. What do you want? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I couldn't bring myself to soften them. Even now, even after everything, some part of me was still trained to be the good daughter, to modulate my tone and manage her feelings. But that part was growing smaller every day, burned away along with everything else she'd destroyed. I know about my house, she said, and I could hear something in her voice that might have been fear. I know someone burned it down, the way they burned down yours. So? Sarah, I need you to know, I didn't mean for your cat to die. I thought you'd be at Jake's apartment. I checked your location on that family tracking app, the one we set up when you moved out. You were always there on Tuesday nights. I thought the house would be empty. The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected as much. She'd planned it so carefully, monitoring my movements, choosing a night when she believed I'd be safe. The fire hadn't been attempted murder after all. It had been calculated destruction, meant to eliminate my independence without physically harming me. Somehow that felt worse. You killed Whiskers. You burned down everything I'd worked for because you wouldn't do what you wanted.
I was trying to save you." The desperation in her voice was growing stronger, more pronounced. "That house, that job, that life you were building, it was beneath you, Sarah. You were wasting yourself on mediocrity when you could have had everything. I built an empire for you, and you were throwing it away to play house in some suburb. It was my choice to make. You were making the wrong choice." The words exploded out of her with sudden fury, and for a moment she sounded like the Linda I knew, the woman who never met a problem she couldn't solve through force of will and strategic manipulation. "You're brilliant. You're capable. You could have run Hartwell Industries someday. Instead, you were working at that dead-end job, living in that tiny house, dating a man with no ambition? Jake has plenty of ambition. He just doesn't need to destroy other people to achieve his goals." There was silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the ambient noise of the jail, distant conversations, the clang of metal doors, the constant hum of institutional life. When Linda spoke again, her voice had returned to that smaller, unfamiliar register. "Someone burned down my house, Sarah. Someone who knew exactly how I'd destroyed yours. They used the same method, the same accelerant pattern. The investigators think it's connected to the media coverage of my case, but I know better." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that someone very close to the situation has access to information about how the fire was set. Someone who knew details that weren't released to the public. Someone who had reason to want me to suffer the same loss I inflicted on you." The implication hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. She thought I'd done it. She thought I'd burned down her mansion in some elaborate act of revenge, using inside knowledge from the investigation to replicate her own methods. "You think I think you found someone to do it for you," Linda said, her voice gaining strength as she built her theory. "I think you decided that legal justice wasn't enough, that you wanted me to understand viscerally what I'd put you through. And I think you convinced someone who cares about you to take that risk on your behalf." The words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit, not because I had orchestrated anything, but because the mysterious text messages suggested that someone had indeed acted on my behalf, someone who felt I deserved that kind of loyalty, someone who'd looked at my situation and decided Linda needed to learn a lesson that went beyond whatever prison sentence she might receive. "I didn't burn down your house," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "Maybe not directly. But did you ask someone to? Did you mention to Jake or to any of your friends that you wished I could understand what it felt like? Did you plant the seed, even inadvertently?" Had I? In the weeks since the fire, I'd certainly expressed anger, frustration, a desire for Linda to face consequences for what she'd done. I'd talked to Jake about feeling like prison wasn't enough, that she needed to understand the scope of what I'd taken from me, but I'd never asked anyone to commit arson on my behalf. I'd never suggested that vigilante justice was the answer. "I didn't burn down your house," I said slowly, "because someone did it because they thought it would help me. That doesn't make me responsible for their choices." "Doesn't it?" Linda's voice carried a bitter edge now. "When you paint someone as a monster, when you tell the world that they tried to murder you, when you refuse reasonable settlements and insist on maximum punishment, what do you think happens? People who care about you start to feel like justice isn't enough. They start to think that maybe they need to take matters into their own hands." "You did try to murder me," the prosecutor said. "The prosecutor said that because it makes for a stronger case. But you know the truth, Sarah. You know I checked your location. You know I made sure you'd be safe. I wanted to destroy the life you were building, not end your actual life. There's a difference." "Is there?" The question came out sharper than I had intended. "You set fire to a house with a living creature inside. You destroyed everything I'd worked for because you wouldn't obey me. You tried to force me back into your control through violence and terror. If that's not attempted murder, it's close enough." Another long silence. When Linda spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost reflective.
I got a letter yesterday from someone claiming responsibility for my house. They said they wanted me to know what it felt like to lose everything in a single night. They said you deserved better than a mother who would destroy her own daughter's life out of spite. My heart started hammering against my ribs. What did the letter say exactly? That they'd been watching the case, following the news coverage, that they'd seen what I did to you and decided I needed to experience the same loss, that they hoped I would think about Whiskers every time I remembered what my home looked like before it burned.
Whiskers. Whoever had written that letter knew about my cat, knew that his death was the part of Linda's crime that had wounded me most deeply. That suggested someone who'd followed the case closely, who understood the emotional details that went beyond the basic facts of arson and property destruction. Did they sign it? Just an initial. The letter J. J. The letter hung in my mind like a weight, heavy with implications I didn't want to examine. Jake's name started with J. So did dozens of other people who might have followed the case, who might have felt moved to act on my behalf. It was probably a coincidence, a random initial chosen by someone who wanted to taunt Linda without revealing their identity. But even as I told myself that, I could feel doubt creeping in around the edges. Jake had been so supportive through everything, so quietly furious about what Linda had done to me. He'd held me while I cried over Whiskers, had helped me navigate the insurance claims and police interviews, and endless bureaucratic aftermath of having your life burned down by someone who was supposed to love you. "Sarah," Linda said, her voice pulling me back to the present moment, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did Jake burn down my house?" "No!" The word came out automatically, a reflex born of loyalty and love and the absolute certainty that Jake wasn't capable of such a thing. He was kind, gentle, principled in a way that made violence seem foreign to his nature. He fixed broken things. He didn't break them. He built people up. He didn't tear them down. "Are you sure?" But even as I started to repeat my denial, images flashed through my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Jake's face when he'd first seen the ruins of my house, the cold anger that had flickered in his eyes, the way he'd held me a little tighter after Linda's arraignment, his jaw set with quiet determination. The fact that he'd been working late several nights recently, coming home with stories about overtime projects that seemed to require unusual hours. "I'm sure," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. "When I was building my business," Linda said, her voice taking on the instructional tone she'd used when I was younger, "I learned that the people who love you are often the most dangerous. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they're willing to do things on your behalf that you'd never ask them to do. They see your pain and they want to fix it, even if fixing it requires them to become someone they never thought they could be." "Jake wouldn't—" "Jake loves you," Linda interrupted. I could see it in his face at the arraignment, the way he looked at me, like he wanted to tear me apart with his bare hands for what I'd done to you. That kind of love is powerful, Sarah. It makes people capable of things they never imagined. After she hung up, I sat in the dark of my rental apartment, turning her words over in my mind like stones I was examining for hidden flaws. The letter with the initial J, Jake's recent late nights, the way he seemed almost unsurprised when I'd told him about Linda's house burning down, as if it was a natural consequence rather than a shocking coincidence. I tried to remember the night Linda's mansion had burned. Had Jake been with me? I thought back to that Thursday evening, trying to reconstruct the timeline. We'd had dinner together, watched a movie on his couch, but he'd left early, said he had work to finish at home. I'd gone back to my apartment alone, had been asleep when the call came about the fire. No. I was being paranoid, letting Linda's manipulation get inside my head the way it always had. She was trying to create doubt, to make me question the one good thing that had emerged from this entire nightmare. Jake was innocent. He had to be. But the doubt, once planted, was difficult to uproot. It followed me through the next day, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. When Jake came over that evening with Chinese takeout and his usual gentle concern, I found myself studying his face for signs of deception, listening to his words for hidden meanings. "You seem distracted," he said, setting down his chopsticks and looking at me with the kind of focused attention that had always made me feel seen and understood. "Is it the trial? Are you worried about testifying?" "My mother called last night," I said, watching his expression carefully. "From jail." Something flickered across Jake's features, too quick to identify, too subtle to be certain. "What did she want?" "To talk about her house burning down. She thinks someone close to the case was responsible. Someone with inside information about how the fire was set." Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the takeout containers between us. When he looked up, his expression was carefully neutral. "What do you think?" "I think she's trying to manipulate me, the way she always has. I think she wants me to doubt the people who care about me, to isolate myself from anyone who might support me through the trial." "That sounds like her," Jake agreed, but his voice carried a strange note I couldn't identify. "Jake?" I said, my heart hammering with a fear I didn't want to name. "Where were you the night her house burned down? The night I got the call from the fire department?" He looked at me for a long moment, his brown eyes steady and sad. "You already know the answer to that question, don't you?" The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming suspicions I'd been trying to deny. "Oh my God, you did it. You actually burned down her house." "Yes." The admission came out quiet and clear, without defense or justification. "I drove to her neighborhood around midnight, poured gasoline around the foundation, and lit it on fire. I watched it burn from across the street, making sure it didn't spread to neighboring properties. Then I drove home and waited for you to get the call." I stared at him, this man I thought I knew, this gentle person who'd never shown me anything but kindness and support. "Why? Why would you do something like that?" "Because I love you," he said simply. "Because I watched what she did to you, saw how it destroyed you, and I couldn't stand the thought of her getting away with it. Prison wasn't enough. She needed to understand what she'd taken from you, needed to feel the same loss she'd inflicted. You could have been killed. You could have been caught. You could be in prison right now facing the same charges she is." "I know." His voice was calm, matter of fact. "I knew the risks when I decided to do it, but seeing you hold Whiskers that morning, seeing you realize that your own mother had tried to murder you, it broke something inside me, Sarah. I couldn't just stand by and let her face some abstract legal consequences while you lived with the real-world devastation she'd caused." I felt like I was falling, like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet and I was tumbling through space with nothing solid to catch me. "The letter. You signed it with a J. I wanted her to know it wasn't random. I wanted her to understand that someone who loved you had decided she deserved to suffer the same loss she'd inflicted. I wanted her to lie awake at night thinking about what her house looked like when it burned, the same way you'd been lying awake thinking about Whiskers. Jake, what you did, it was arson. It was a felony. If they catch you—" "They won't," he said with quiet confidence. "I was careful. I avoided the security cameras, wore clothing that couldn't be traced back to me, paid for the gasoline with cash. The only way they'll connect me to the fire is if you tell them." The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Jake had committed a serious crime on my behalf, had risked his freedom and his future to give me a kind of justice the legal system couldn't provide. And now he was trusting me with the knowledge that could destroy his life, counting on my love and loyalty to keep his secret. "You shouldn't have done this," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. "Maybe not," Jake agreed, "but I'm not sorry I did. She destroyed your life because you wouldn't be the daughter she wanted. She killed Whiskers because he was just collateral damage in her war against your independence. Someone needed to show her that actions have consequences, that you can't hurt the people I love without expecting retaliation. But what if someone had been hurt? What if the fire had spread? What if... I made sure the house was empty. I checked with a contact at the jail to confirm she was still in custody. I chose a night with minimal wind to prevent spreading. I stayed and watched to make sure no one was in danger. He reached across the table and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. I didn't do this recklessly, Sarah. I did it with the same care and planning she used when she burned down your house. The difference is that my target was actually guilty. We sat in silence for a while, the takeout growing cold between us, as I tried to process what I'd learned. Jake was an arsonist. The man I loved, the one person I'd trusted completely through this entire nightmare, had committed a felony and was apparently at peace with that decision. He'd looked at my situation and decided that vigilante justice was not only appropriate, but necessary. "Are you going to turn me in?" he asked finally, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that would shape the rest of our lives. If I reported Jake to the police, he would almost certainly be arrested, charged, and convicted. The evidence might be circumstantial, but combined with his confession to me, it would probably be enough to send him to prison for years. I would lose the one person who'd stood by me through everything, would have to testify against another person I loved, would be alone again in a world that seemed determined to punish loyalty and love. But if I stayed silent, I would be complicit in his crime, an accessory after the fact to arson and destruction of property. I would be choosing love over law, personal loyalty over abstract justice. I would be deciding that some crimes were acceptable when committed for the right reasons by people who cared about you. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what the right thing to do is anymore." Jake nodded, as if he'd expected that response. "Linda trained you to doubt yourself, to assume that if you're in conflict with someone, it must be because you're wrong. But sometimes the right thing isn't the legal thing. Sometimes justice looks different than what the system can provide." "You're sounding like you're trying to convince me." "I'm trying to remind you that you're allowed to make choices based on what feels right to you, not what other people think you should do. Your mother destroyed your life because you wouldn't comply with her vision of who you should be. Don't let the legal system do the same thing to us." That night, I lay awake in my rental apartment, staring at the ceiling and turning Jake's revelation over in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. He'd burned down Linda's house because he loved me. He'd committed arson as an act of devotion, a way of showing me that my pain mattered enough to risk everything for. It was the most romantic and terrifying thing anyone had ever done for me. Part of me was horrified by what he'd done, by the casual way he'd decided that the law didn't apply when someone he loved had been wronged. Part of me was afraid of what other lines he might be willing to cross in the name of protecting me, what other crimes he might consider justified if I were threatened again. But a larger part of me was grateful. Grateful that someone had finally shown Linda that her actions had consequences. Grateful that Whiskers' death had been acknowledged and avenged. Grateful that I mattered enough to someone, that they would risk their freedom to balance the scales on my behalf. Linda had burned down my house because I wouldn't be the daughter she wanted. Jake had burned down her house because I was exactly the woman he loved. The symmetry was almost poetic, a kind of justice that the legal system could never provide. As dawn broke over the city, painting my rental apartment in shades of gold and orange that reminded me of fire, I made my decision. I would keep Jake's secret. I would choose love over law, loyalty over abstract principles. I would let him carry the weight of what he'd done while I carried the weight of knowing about it. Because sometimes, in a world that seemed determined to punish the innocent and reward the cruel, the only justice available was the kind you created for yourself. The trial began on a Monday morning in late May. Before we continue with Sarah's testimony, I want to pause here. Creating and researching these deeply emotional true stories takes considerable time and effort to ensure accuracy and sensitivity. If you're finding yourself invested in Sarah's journey and want to see how justice unfolds, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories like this one. The courthouse steps crowded with reporters and curiosity seekers drawn by the spectacle of a mother accused of trying to murder her own daughter. I sat in the witness waiting room, my hands folded in my lap, trying to reconcile the woman I was about to testify against with the mother who had once taught me to braid friendship bracelets and insisted on taking pictures of every birthday cake I'd ever blown out candles on. Jake had driven me to the courthouse, his presence as steady as always, despite the weight of the secret we now shared. He squeezed my hand before I went inside, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that spoke volumes about everything we couldn't say aloud. "You're going to do fine," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had sustained me through everything. "Just tell the truth. Your truth." District Attorney Vance had prepared me well for this moment, walking me through the questions she would ask and the cross-examination I should expect from Marcus Rothschild. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for the reality of sitting in that witness chair, looking across the courtroom at Linda in her carefully chosen conservative suit, her hair styled to project dignity and maternal concern. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the proceedings in a way that made me think of a house after a fire. The basic structure still standing, but hollowed out, emptied of everything that had once made it seem substantial. When our eyes met, I saw none of the hatred that had burned there during the arraignment. Instead, there was something that looked almost like pleading, as if she was asking me to remember the mother she had been before everything went wrong. "Miss Chen," DA Vance began, her voice carrying the formal weight of legal proceedings, "can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant, Linda Hartwell?" I told them everything. About growing up as Linda's only child, about the pressure to be perfect, about the way her love had always felt conditional on my compliance with her vision of who I should be. I described the ultimatum she delivered in my living room, the threats that had followed my refusal to abandon my independence and return to the fold of her control. "She said I needed to learn consequences," I testified, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "And did you understand that as a threat?" "Not at the time. I thought she meant I'd stop speaking to me. Maybe cut me off financially. I never imagined she meant this."
When DA Vance asked me to describe the night of the fire, I found myself reliving those terrible early morning hours, the phone call that shattered my sleep, the drive through empty streets, the sight of my house reduced to charred skeleton and ash. I talked about finding Whiskers, about the way his small body had felt in my arms, still warm but utterly, finally still. "He trusted me to keep him safe," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to remain composed. "He'd been abandoned before, left to die in a parking lot, and I promised him that would never happen again. But I couldn't protect him from this." I could see several jurors wiping their eyes, and even Judge Martinez looked affected by the testimony. But Linda remained motionless, her face a mask of careful neutrality that revealed nothing of what she might be feeling. Marcus Rothschild's cross-examination was everything DA Vance had warned me it would be.
a careful dissection of my relationship with Linda, designed to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who had turned on her mother out of spite and greed. He questioned my motives for refusing Linda's generous offer to work at Hartwell Industries, suggested that my independence was really just stubborn pride that had driven a loving mother to desperate measures. Isn't it true, Miss Chen, that you resented your mother's success, that you blamed her for your father's abandonment and carried that resentment into adulthood? No, I said firmly. I was grateful for everything she'd given me. I just wanted to build something of my own. Something that explicitly rejected everything she'd worked to provide for you? Something that reflected who I actually was, not who she wanted me to be. Rothschild pressed harder, his questions becoming more pointed and personal. He brought up every argument Linda and I had ever had, every moment of teenage rebellion, every choice I'd made that had disappointed her. He painted a picture of a daughter who had systematically rejected her mother's love and guidance, who had chosen mediocrity over excellence out of some misguided need to prove her independence. Miss Chen, isn't it true that on multiple occasions you told your mother you wished she was dead? The question hit like a physical blow, dragging up memories I'd tried to bury. There had been moments, during my teenage years, when Linda's criticism and control had felt so suffocating that I'd lashed out with the cruelest words I could find. I was 15, maybe 16, screaming at her during one of our epic battles about curfew or grades or the friends she didn't approve of. I was a teenager, I said quietly. I said a lot of things I didn't mean when I was angry. But you did say it. Multiple times, according to my client's recollection. Yes, I said it, but I didn't mean it. How can the court be sure you don't mean it now? How can we trust the testimony of a daughter who has repeatedly expressed hatred for her mother? Because she tried to kill me, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Because she burned down my house with my cat inside because I wouldn't do what she wanted. Because whatever terrible things I might have said as a teenager, I never actually tried to hurt her. The redirect examination gave DA Vance a chance to repair some of the damage Rothschild had inflicted, to remind the jury that teenage rebellion was normal and that no amount of family dysfunction justified arson and animal cruelty. But I could see the doubt in some of their faces. The way Rothschild's questions had planted seeds of uncertainty about my credibility and motives. Linda's testimony came the next day, and it was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as maternal concern. She took the stand wearing a navy blue dress that made her look both professional and vulnerable, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion as she described the pain of watching her only daughter reject everything she'd tried to provide. I built Hartwell Industries for Sarah, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Every deal I made, every risk I took, every sacrifice, it was all so she could have opportunities I never had. And she threw it all away to work at a dead-end job and live in a house that wasn't worthy of her potential. She painted herself as a concerned mother driven to desperate measures by love and fear for her daughter's future. The fire, she claimed, had been meant as a wake-up call, a way to force me to recognize that the life I was building wasn't sustainable or worthy of my abilities. I never meant for anyone to be hurt, she said, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine remorse. I checked Sarah's location to make sure she wasn't home. I thought she would realize that she needed help, that she couldn't continue down this path of self-destruction. And the cat? DA Vance asked during cross-examination. For the first time, Linda's composure cracked, her careful mask slipping to reveal something raw and human underneath. I didn't know about the cat. Sarah had never mentioned having a pet. If I had known, she trailed off, her hands shaking as she reached for her water glass. If you had known, would you have called off your plan to burn down your daughter's house? Linda was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options, calculating which answer would serve her best. I don't know, she said finally. I hope so, but I was so desperate to save her from the life she was building that I might have convinced myself the cat would escape, that it would be frightened but unharmed. The honesty of that admission was more devastating than any denial could have been. It revealed the depth of her conviction that she knew what was best for me, that her vision of my life was so obviously correct that any collateral damage was acceptable in service of achieving it. The jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those 72 hours in a state of suspended animation, unable to eat or sleep or focus on anything beyond the 12 strangers who were deciding Linda's fate, and in some ways, my own. Jake stayed with me constantly, his presence an anchor in the storm of uncertainty, though I could see the weight of his own secret growing heavier as the hours passed. What if they acquit her? I asked on the second night, lying awake in his arms while rain drummed against the windows of my rental apartment. He said, "They won't," his voice parrying a certainty I wished I could share. "The evidence is too strong, her admission too damning. She might get a lighter sentence than the prosecution wants, but she won't walk away from this." And if they convict her, what happens to us? What happens to what you did? Jake was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking my hair with gentle persistence. Nothing happens unless you want it to. The police investigation into my house fire is going nowhere. They have no physical evidence, no witnesses, no real leads. As long as you don't tell them what you know, they'll eventually classify it as unsolved and move on to cases they can actually prosecute. But I'll always know. We'll always know. Yes, he agreed. We'll carry that knowledge for the rest of our lives. The question is whether you can live with it, whether you can accept that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you make for yourself. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon that felt heavy with the promise of summer storms. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, Jake beside me, as the jury foreman stood to deliver their decision. On the charge of first-degree arson, we find the defendant guilty.
On the charge of animal cruelty resulting in death, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant not guilty. The words washed over me in waves, each verdict carrying its own weight of vindication and loss. Linda had been convicted of the major charges, but the jury had apparently believed her claim that she hadn't intended to kill me, that the fire had been meant as destruction rather than murder. I looked at her as the verdicts were read, watching her face for any sign of emotion. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing of what she might be feeling. Even now, even facing the possibility of decades in prison, she maintained the careful control that had defined her throughout my life. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Linda remained in jail without bail, and I tried to figure out how to rebuild a life from the ashes of everything I'd lost. The insurance settlement had finally come through, providing enough money to buy a new house and replace some of my belongings, but no amount of compensation could restore the sense of safety and belonging that had been destroyed along with my old life. Jake and I looked at houses together, driving through neighborhoods and imagining what it might be like to start fresh somewhere new. But every potential home felt like a stage set, a place where we would perform the roles of a normal couple, building a normal life while carrying the weight of secrets that could destroy everything we'd built. "Maybe we should leave," I said one afternoon as we sat in yet another real estate agent's car, looking at yet another house that felt like someone else's idea of what I should want. "Maybe we should go somewhere new, where no one knows our story, where we can be whoever we want to be." "Is that what you want?" Jake asked, his hand finding mine in the space between our seats. "I don't know what I want anymore. I thought I wanted justice, but I got it, and it doesn't feel the way I expected. I thought I wanted my mother to face consequences, but watching her in that courtroom, seeing her so diminished, it just makes me sad." "You're allowed to feel sad about her conviction," Jake said gently. "She's still your mother, whatever else she's done. It's normal to grieve the relationship you wanted to have, even when you know it was never possible." The sentencing hearing was held on a sweltering July day that made the courthouse feel like an oven. Judge Martinez listened to victim impact statements from me and character references from Linda's business associates, her face grave as she weighed the arguments for mercy against the severity of the crimes. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said finally, "your actions were not those of a mother motivated by love, but of a person who believed she had the right to destroy another human being's life when they failed to comply with your vision of who they should be. You have shown no genuine remorse for the suffering you caused, only regret that your plan didn't achieve the outcome you desired." Linda stood to receive her sentence, her spine straight and her chin lifted with the dignity she'd maintained throughout the trial.
Even facing judgment, she carried herself like someone who had never doubted her right to exist in the world exactly as she was. On the charge of first-degree arson, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. On the charge of animal cruelty resulting in death, I sentence you to 2 years to be served concurrently. You will be eligible for parole after serving 12 years of your sentence. 12 years! Linda would be in her 70s when she got out, an old woman emerging into a world that had moved on without her. The company she had built would be run by others, the life she had constructed would be a memory, and the daughter she had tried to control would be middle-aged and, hopefully, healed from the wounds she had inflicted. As the bailiff led Linda away, she turned to look at me one last time. Her expression was unreadable, but I thought I saw something that might have been regret flicker across her features. Not remorse for what she'd done, but sorrow for the life we might have had if she'd been capable of loving me without conditions, if she'd been able to see me as a person rather than a reflection of her own ambitions.
After the sentencing, Jake and I drove to the cemetery where Whiskers was buried. The small headstone I'd chosen was simple but dignified, engraved with his name and the dates of his short life, along with a line that captured everything he'd meant to me. He loved without conditions. I knelt beside his grave, my fingers tracing the letters of his name while Jake stood quietly behind me, a guardian presence in a world that had proven itself capable of sudden violence and loss. "It's over," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Whiskers, to Jake, or to myself. She can't hurt us anymore. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Linda's influence would follow me for the rest of my life, shaping the way I loved and trusted and believed in my own worth. The fire had destroyed more than my house and my cat. It had burned away the naive belief that family meant safety, that love was unconditional, that the people who were supposed to protect you would never choose to harm you instead. Yet, sitting there in the summer heat, with Jake's steady presence behind me and Whiskers' memory before me, I felt something like peace settling over me for the first time in months. Linda was in prison, facing the consequences of her choices. Jake had risked everything to show me that my pain mattered, that some injustices demanded more than legal resolution. And I had learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, capable of surviving betrayal and loss and the kind of cruelty that burns everything beautiful to the ground. "What now?" Jake asked as we walked back to the car, the cemetery quiet around us except for the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the summer wind. "Now we build something new," I said, taking his hand and feeling the calluses on his fingers from years of honest work, the strength that had held me together when everything else was falling apart. "We find a house. We plant a garden. We get a new cat when we're ready. We create a life that's ours, not defined by what was destroyed, but by what we choose to build from the ashes." That evening, we made an offer on a small blue house with white trim, not unlike the one Linda had burned down. But this one would be different. This one would be built on truth rather than illusion, protected by love that came without conditions, warmed by the knowledge that sometimes the deepest justice comes not from courtrooms and judges, but from the simple act of choosing to keep building beautiful things in a world that seems determined to tear them down.
The story takes a devastating turn when Sarah returns home one evening to find her house engulfed in flames. In that inferno, she loses everything: her home, her possessions, her sense of security, and most heartbreakingly, her beloved cat Whiskers, who dies in the fire. What initially appears to be a tragic accident becomes something far more sinister when the investigation reveals the fire was deliberately set using accelerant. The truth that emerges is almost incomprehensible. Linda, Sarah's own mother, had burned down her daughter's house in a twisted attempt to force her back into dependence and compliance. Linda's reasoning was chillingly calculating. She believed that by destroying Sarah's independent life, she could manipulate her daughter into accepting the future she had planned for her. The death of Whiskers, Sarah discovers, was not collateral damage, but a deliberate act of cruelty designed to cause maximum emotional pain. The legal proceedings that follow expose the full extent of Linda's manipulation and control. During the trial, a pattern of psychological abuse emerges, painting a picture of a mother who had never learned to love without conditions. Linda's defense attempts to portray her actions as misguided love, but the evidence is overwhelming. She had systematically tried to destroy her daughter's autonomy and happiness when Sarah refused to conform to her expectations. The trial becomes not just about legal justice, but about Sarah's journey toward understanding the difference between love and control. She realizes that Linda's version of love was actually a form of possession, a demand that Sarah sacrifice her authentic self to fulfill her mother's ambitions and insecurities. In a parallel storyline that adds moral complexity to the narrative, Jake struggles with his own response to Linda's crimes. Driven by love for Sarah and fury at the injustice she suffered, Jake makes a decision that mirrors Linda's actions but comes from a completely different motivation. He burns down Linda's house in an act of vigilante justice, ensuring she experiences the same loss and violation she inflicted on her daughter. This revelation adds layers to the story's exploration of justice, revenge, and the lengths people will go to protect those they love. Unlike Linda's calculated cruelty, Jake's actions stem from genuine love and a desire to balance the scales when the legal system seems insufficient. The secret of what he did becomes something Sarah and Jake carry together, deepening their bond while raising questions about the nature of justice and the moral complexities of love. The heart of the story lies in Sarah's remarkable journey of reconstruction, not just of her physical circumstances, but of her entire understanding of what love and family mean. With Jake's support, she begins to build a new life based on choice rather than obligation, authenticity rather than performance. They buy a small blue house and create a home that reflects their actual values and dreams rather than anyone else's expectations. Sarah starts a garden, learning that the most beautiful things grow slowly with patient tending. They adopt a new cat, Meredith, understanding that while nothing can replace what was lost, there's always room for new love and new beginnings. As years pass, Sarah and Jake's relationship deepens into something Linda could never understand: love without agenda. Their wedding, held in their own garden 5 years after the fire, represents everything Linda's version of love was not. Simple, honest, and focused on celebrating who they actually were, rather than who they thought they should be. The arrival of their daughter Clara marks another crucial chapter in Sarah's healing journey. Becoming a mother herself, Sarah is determined to offer Clara what she never had: love without conditions, support without manipulation, and the freedom to become whoever she's meant to be. Through raising Clara, Sarah breaks the generational cycle of conditional love that had defined her relationship with Linda.
Linda's death in prison 10 years after the trial brings closure to one chapter of Sarah's story. Rather than feeling triumph or relief, Sarah experiences a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the mother Linda could have been, acceptance of who she actually was, and peace in knowing that the possibility of reconciliation has ended, freeing her from the hope and disappointment cycle that had persisted. In a final posthumous gesture, Linda leaves Sarah a box of childhood photographs that reveal the mother she had been before control and expectations poisoned their relationship. These images show Linda loving Sarah purely and unconditionally, providing evidence that the capacity for healthy love had existed, even if it was eventually overwhelmed by Linda's need to control. This discovery allows Sarah to hold space for the complexity of her relationship with Linda, acknowledging the real love that existed alongside the real damage, understanding that people can be both loving and cruel, often toward the same person.
20 years after the fire, Sarah reflects on the profound lessons her traumatic experience taught her. She learned that destruction can sometimes clear the ground for something better to grow. The life Linda tried to force her into would have been too small for who Sarah was meant to become. The fire, devastating as it was, freed her from existence based on other people's expectations and opened the possibility for authentic happiness. Most importantly, Sarah learned that love should liberate rather than imprison, celebrate rather than control, and accept rather than demand change. These lessons shaped how she loved Jake, how she raised Clara, and how she understood her own worth. This powerful narrative ultimately becomes a testament to human resilience and the possibility of healing from even the most profound betrayals. It shows how authentic love can triumph over manipulation, how truth can be more powerful than performance, and how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for everything beautiful that follows. Sarah's story reminds us that we can break cycles of dysfunction, that we can choose to love differently than we were loved, and that it's possible to build something magnificent from the ashes of what was destroyed. Her journey from victim to survivor to someone who thrives demonstrates that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control what we build from the pieces that remain. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the nature of love, family, and resilience in your own life, I invite you to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Stories have the power to heal, to illuminate truth, and to remind us of our shared humanity. By subscribing, you'll join a community of listeners who believe in the transformative power of well-told stories and the hope that even in our darkest moments, there's always the possibility of building something beautiful from whatever remains. Subscribe today, and let's continue exploring these profound human experiences together.